let's right now jump into two very exciting keynotes, each followed by Q&A. Our first guest is one of the planet's leading experts on synergies and complexities of forests. She is, in the last time, highly influential and a world-renowned pathfinder on the frontier of plant and trees, intelligence and communication. And she is currently a best-selling author of the book Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forests. She will join us online. So please extend a warm welcome to Dr. Suzanne Simard, Professor of Forest Ecology at British Columbia University in Vancouver in Canada. Oh, here she is. A big applause, ladies and gentlemen. Susan, can you hear us?
I can hear you. It's so nice to be here.
Fine.
It's so nice to see you.
We are so proud to have you. It's really, it's a big thing for us here in Kitzbühel. Where are you joining us now?
I'm in a little town just west of the Rocky Mountains in British Columbia.
In British Columbia.
In a town called Nelson. Yeah.
And how is the forest recovering from the wildfires last year?
The fires have been very extensive and severe, and we're worried about how they're recovering, and I'm not sure because it's been so recent.
Okay.
But definitely there's a big concern.
But this wildfire, was this business as usual or something bigger? Is it due to climate change? What's your opinion?
Yes, well, I'd say about the last 5 or 6 years, we've had fire years that are bigger than we've seen in the last century. Okay. So the extent and the severity of the fires are greater, and we are pretty sure it's fueled by climate change, along with management practices have also contributed, as well as fire suppression. So we really do have a lot to figure out to try to make our forests more resilient to fire and resistant to fire. So we've got a lot to learn and a lot to do for sure.
Susan, I can tell you here in Kitzbühel in Tyrol, we have a perfect weather for them, for the trees and the forest. It's raining the whole day, about 20 liters per square meter. It's not horrible. It's wonderful. The audience here in Tyrol is gathered from every field. We have foresters, we have people from the timber industry, scientists, and so on. But to be honest, if I look around, I can almost only see men, a lot of men. So what we urgently need, is the wisdom of a bright woman. So we are looking forward to your presentation. The stage is yours. Big applause for Susan.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Can you see that okay? I'm hoping that you can hear me. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to talk to you today about our West Coast forests, and I think there are things that we've learned that apply to forests all around the world. And this has really taken me a whole career to figure some of this stuff out. And of course, it's an evolving science. It's always interesting and fascinating, especially with climate change. It just keeps us needing to learn more and more as we go. So I'm going to talk to you about my home forests. Okay, here we go. And I live along the west coast of North America. And you can see here some of the islands along the west coast. These are the Discovery and the Gulf Islands, just off the mainland of British Columbia. This environment stretches all the way up into the Alaska Panhandle, into Alaska, and then south down into Oregon and Washington. So this is an extensive area that is called the Pacific Rim forests. And these forests are often what people think of as our iconic old growth forests. They're home to, immense trees. And it's because of the West Coast climate, with the Pacific Ocean bringing, winds that come eastward, lots of rainfall, quite moderate maritime climates. And because of this, these are considered some of the most diverse and productive temperate forests of the world. In fact, scientists recently counting carbon, counting biodiversity have determined that they really are on par with the great tropical rainforests of the Amazon, the Congo, and the other Pacific Rim forests across the Pacific Ocean. And I mentioned that they're home to biodiversity. These little islands that are along the West Coast are home to many, many unique and rare endemic plant species. In fact, my daughter, one of my daughters, has got a job this summer, and she sent me these photos of these incredible, beautiful plants that are on these Pacific coastal islands. Many of them, as I said, are species at risk. And of course, they are also threatened by human intervention, which I'll talk about a little later on. But just keep in mind that the species diversity is incredible, endemic, and there are many rare and endangered plants. As you move inland, of course, away from the islands, and you get more into the deep mountains and deep valleys and estuaries of the Pacific Coast, you find these forests. These forests you've probably seen pictures of. These are the immense cedar, hemlock, spruce forests that contain, upon our counts, as much carbon as an Amazon rainforest. The difference between our forests and those forests is that we have lower species diversity in the tree canopy, but the diversity we think in the soil is even greater. So it's really just a shifting of where that biodiversity exists. And when we count carbon, there is as much carbon in these forests as in the Amazon rainforest, around 1,300 tons per hectare. These forests have also not seen disturbance in a long, long time because they're rainy rainforests, receiving in some places 200 centimeters of rainfall every year. They have not seen wildfires for 10,000 years. They have not seen major insect and pathogen disturbances for a long, long time. So in a sense, even though they're productive, they're not necessarily as resilient to these things because they have not occurred for a long time. In that 10,000 years, there's also been a lot of caring of these forests, caring by the Aboriginal people of North America. And so the people lived in and were interdependent with the forests. The entire worldview of our Aboriginal nations, of which there are 203 recognized nations in British Columbia, worked with these forests to ensure they were continuing to be regenerative and provided the materials that they needed, the food. The cedar trees, known as the tree of life, provided clothing, timbers for longhouses, great poles for family poles or totem poles. And of course, we're managed to keep all the resources, to help keep all the resources intact and thrifty, and to provide them for the many generations to come. In fact, many of the Aboriginal views are that we need to look after the next 7 generations, always keep that in mind. And it was really great to hear that. I think that the European model is very similar. They're mostly family-based forests with the mind to the next generations. In this forest, you can see that there's lots of regeneration in this forest. It's an old growth forest. It's characterized by gaps with young trees coming up underneath the canopy of the old trees. There are old stumps. Those stumps provide legacies that are full of fungi and bacteria and animals that keep the forest strong, help distribute seeds, for example, help decompose the wood, to help cycle nutrients. And all of these cycles need to be kept intact in order for the forest to continue to sequester carbon, provide biodiversity, and those things go together to make a healthy forest that also provides products for humans. I just want to harken back a little bit more to the Aboriginal way of managing the forest, because we have a lot to learn from them. And in fact, the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change has come out and said, it is the Aboriginal management of forests that we need to learn in order to make sure our forests remain healthy and resilient as climate changes, which is going to be a huge challenge. And the reason that they said that is because when we look worldwide at where the biggest carbon stocks and the greatest biodiversity are in worldwide are in Aboriginal managed forests. This is one of those forests that you're looking at. This is an old village called Ho'ayet, and Ho'ayet has many features to it that I'm just going to point out a few. One is that these estuaries are managed for clams. So there are clam beds in these estuaries that have been managed for millennia. And these clams provide a great deal of protein that seeps into the soils, but also provides food for the village people that live in this forest. Out here, as I'm going to show you, there are also tidal stone traps where salmon were fished for and using sustainable practices. And in these forests here are a bunch of gardens. I know that you can't see them because it's been a long time since the people were in this forest. They were removed from the forest during colonization and put into reserves. But now the people are moving back to the forest to try to restore their clam beds, their tidal stone traps, and their forest gardens. I'll talk a little bit more about that as I go forward. What we're looking at here is along an estuary, a forest garden. And really, when Europeans came to North America, they said, oh, that the Aboriginal people were not agrarian people, that they didn't have agriculture, but they did. When we look more closely now, we can see evidence of that everywhere in these estuaries along the coast. And so you see this, basically a conifer landscape, but along the river there are planted cottonwood trees which protect the streams. Inside here you can find all kinds of food plants, hazelnuts, salmon berries, apple trees, all kinds of trees that provided food. And now today, the Aboriginal people know that these forest gardens, when they're revitalized, they can easily provide the food for the family. The huckleberries, the salmon berries, the thimbleberries, the nut trees, the apple trees, the shelter trees, the habitat for the animals. And even today, when they go hunting, they go to these village sites because they are so diverse, because this is the place where biodiversity has been maintained by people for a long, long time. And I just want to point out too, I mentioned the tidal stone traps. The tidal stone traps are all up and down the coast and are one of the incredible fishing technologies that were used by the coastal nations, including the Haida, the Tsimshian, the Tlingit, the Heiltsuk people. And the way that these work is that the salmon would come in to spawn, and they would become entrained behind these stone walls that have been built along the coastline. And then the people would passively fish for the salmon. But one of their technologies was that they only fished on the low ebb tide instead of the high tide to make sure that they were getting actually the smallest fish, because the larger fish could escape back into the ocean. And then they always left the big mother fish during the fall spawning season to go and spawn upstream. And by protecting the big mothers, those big mothers could then lay big eggs, and that produced bigger fry, and that produced bigger fish for future generations. And so in this way, the salmon populations were actually really closely monitored, closely attended to, cared for, and those populations were healthy and strong for thousands and thousands of years. Of course, the colonial way of managing salmon has not been that at all. It's about taking all of the fish across the entire size classes, and that we know has led to the demise or the destruction of the salmon industry. Now, upstream, these fish are a really important part of the life cycle of the forest. This is a grizzly bear who has been fishing along the salmon stream where this fish has been spawning. And this bear can actually take about 200 fish per day up into the forest. And not just bears, but wolves and eagles as well. And these fish then end up in the forest floor, and because they're not fully eaten, some of the carcass is left behind. And you can see when I go into these forests in the fall, when anybody goes in, you can see in some of these forests, they're just completely covered with salmon carcasses. And it's because the bears only eat a portion of the fish. And so what happens to the rest? Well, it decays. It decays and it ends up part of the forest floor. And in that process of decay, it seeps into the forest floor, enriches the forest floor, and then becomes available for uptake by trees and other plants. So how does that work? And so, and I want to, now start with my research, and I'm continuing to work with my graduate students on these salmon forests. But what I was interested in back when I was a graduate student in the earlier days, and still today, all my grad students, almost all of them, work on this, is how do these nutrients and how do the water end up being transmitted into these trees, and how do these creatures in the soil help these trees acquire the resources they need, and also link together and become resilient, help them become resilient to all the stresses that they're encountering. So I started out looking at fungi, especially mycorrhizal fungi. This is a mycorrhizal fungus called Amanita muscaria. I'm sure you're familiar with it in Europe. And these mycorrhizas function in that they grow through the soil, picking up nutrients and water, and deliver those nutrients and water back to the tree, which provides photosynthate. And of course, what we're looking at is the fruiting body, which is what disperses spores and keeps the genetic heterogeneity high in these populations. And when you look underneath in the forest floor, what you see are the incredible hyphae, or the mycelium that grows from these trees. So they're attached to the root systems of the trees. The mycelium grows through the forest floor, picking up nutrients and water and delivering it back. And there are literally thousands and thousands of these species worldwide. In our forest, a single forest can have about 100 species per hectare of different mycorrhizal fungi, and they all have different niches or different roles in the ecosystem. Some are really good at acquiring nutrients that are sequestered in wood, like in this case. Some are really good at acquiring nutrients that are in mineral soils. Some are really good at getting water from very dry soil pores. But the main thing here is that they all have a niche and they're all important. So keep in mind then, an old growth forest has about, on the studies I've done at least, about 100 species per hectare. And just to give you an idea of the magnificent impact that these mycelium have on the ecosystem, you can see on the left-hand picture here a seedling that's actually grown in the lab, and that's been inoculated with a single mycorrhizal fungus called Pisolithus. And you can see that the actual biomass of this system, the seedling, the roots, and the mycorrhizal fungus, which is this very gauzy-looking hyphae, that the amount of carbon that moves into these systems is really high. It depends on what kind of ecosystem you're in. But in dry ecosystems, like in grasslands, it can be up to 80% of the energy goes into feeding this mycorrhizal network and the whole soil system. In a forest, it can be as low as 20% in really productive rainy rainforests, but it can be very, very high, a huge amount of energy put into it. And this mycelium doesn't just exist on its own. It's actually in a whole food web of other creatures. And so in this picture, you can see that there are nematodes, there are other fungi and bacteria, there are mites, there are columbella, spiders, centipedes, amoebas, and these are organized in what we call a soil food web. And that soil food web works by feeding on different levels of the food web, including the mycorrhizal fungi. And as they feed on the trophic level above them or below them, they get energy, but they also gain nutrients. And in the decay and turnover of those creatures, these nutrients are returned back to the soil and available for the hyphae in the tree roots to take them up. They also provide through this process, a lot of mucilages and exudates that give the soil structure. And that structure is why water and soil nutrients can be held in the soil instead of leached out or run off in a rainfall. Now, even what I became fascinated with is that in the early 80s, there was studies done in the UK by David Reed who showed that even a mycorrhizal fungus can link trees, seedlings together. He did this work in the laboratory, but you can see how this is a Pinus sylvestris, and it is linked directly into its other Pinus neighbor, and that they were able to transmit carbon back and forth between them. So I became really fascinated with this, and I wanted to know, was this happening in forests in North America? And if they were they in part of the resilience of these ecosystems? And so my students and I got together over many years, and we did some work with our forests, our multi-aged old growth forests, and we made a map of what these mycorrhizal networks would look like in the forest. This was years and years of work of using highly developed DNA techniques called microsatellite analysis. And so what we did is we went into a forest, and this is a forest that's quite stylized. It's a graph of the forest where these circles represent the trees and the lines represent one species of the 100 mycorrhizal fungal species that existed in this forest. This species, these black lines represent a rhizopogon species, which is associated simply with Douglas fir. So these circles represent the Douglas fir trees. And the bigger the circle, the bigger the tree. And the darker the circle, the older the tree. So this tree here is about 250 years old and has a diameter of about 1 meter. And it's a multi-age forest with codominant trees, intermediate trees, and saplings and seedlings in the understory. So it's multi-aged and multi-staged. Okay, so there's so many things to learn from this figure that took us 5 years to develop this little map of one little 30 by 30 meter hectare forest. We've made maps of this in 6 other forests, so we feel confident that this is actually true. And it's also very simplistic because we have not gone back and made a map of all the species in the forest, fungal species networks in the forest, but we can learn a lot from this. One is that these big old trees are the most highly connected. When we look, using graph theory at how many connections all these different size and age trees are, we find that the big old trees are the most highly connected to all the other trees. This particular tree is connected to 80% of the other trees in this forest. And it can be either a direct connection like to this tree, or it can be through various intermediary trees. For example, this is connected to this tree, which is connected to this tree, which is connected to this tree, and so on. And so there's many intermediary linkages, but overall, what we found is every tree is linked to every other tree in the forest. So this is fascinating. I wanted to know in all my studies with my students is, what do these networks do in forests? How important are they? And that continues to be a debate in circles of mycorrhizal fungal ecologists among foresters as well. But I think that we can make some inferences from this map. And one of them is that these little trees and these intermediate trees, these younger trees, which obviously their seeds have fallen from the crowns of the old trees that are surrounding them, germinate in the forest floor. And within a month, we found they become colonized by the network that exists in the soil. That's the main way that they become colonized. Of course, they can also become colonized by spores, but by and large, it's by the fungal network that's already in the soil. And the more diverse that network, the more diverse the fungi that are able to colonize those seedlings. So when a seedling starts out, it's usually 1 or 2 seedlings that come on, then it takes a little bit of time, and then there's 3 or 4. By the time that seedling is about 25 years old, a sapling, it's got about 50% of the species diversity of the old trees. And by the time they're 100 years old, they're have the full diversity expressed by the older trees. So it takes time. The other thing we found is that these seedlings, when they become colonized like that, they're able to take up resources, and that increases their survival. So they're able to survive better when they're linked into the network of the old trees. We've gone on to do more work, not just in the forest, but in laboratories and in the greenhouse with many students. And we also asked the question of whether or not these old trees could recognize which of these seedlings were their own kin, and did that really matter? And it turns out in our studies of growing full sibling seedlings together in the greenhouse with and without mycorrhizal networks intact, that indeed they can recognize their own kin. And the way we detected this is that we could find that the kin mother trees, so we grew larger trees with smaller ones around them that were full siblings, that they transmitted more carbon through their mycorrhizal networks from their photosynthetic crowns right into the root systems and the mycorrhizal networks of their full sibling seedlings compared to stranger seedlings. We also found that these networks were very instrumental in this transmission of of this carbon and information, I would say, not just resources, but information. We found that they were able to transmit defense signals as well. That yes, that these mycorrhizal networks were instrumental in this, although, you know, there are, it seems like, many pathways of transmission, not just through the network of fungi, but also the other networks that exist in the soil, the microbial networks. Even through soil, there can be transmission of information and resources. And so now, you know, when we look at a forest like this, I see the forest as a highly connected place, that it's interdependent on these connections that exist below ground. And that, you know, that we shouldn't, as we have in the past, thought of trees as just individual isolated individuals. They're actually, you know, exist together in community. Now, we started calling these big old trees mother trees because they had that nurturing capacity, because we knew that these old trees not only provided seed, but provided the foundation for these young seedlings to get going, that these old trees really have nurtured this whole forest all around them. So in our forests in North America, when we go into an old growth forest, it's pretty easy to say, oh, you know, that big old tree, that's clearly a mother tree. In managed forests, it's not so easy, but really, I think when you're thinking about it, all you need to think is that the biggest trees do have the biggest crowns, the dominant trees, because they've got the biggest crowns, the greatest photosynthetic capacity, and therefore they distribute more energy through their networks. And so it's pretty easy to identify, oh, you know, those dominant trees are really the mother trees, even in a planted forest. And these mother trees, you know, in our forests are really essential, not just when they're living, but when they've fallen over and have passed on as well. So this is an old mother tree that has died. She's now what we call coarse woody debris. This tree is connected still to this old tree in the background. This old tree is connected through mycorrhizal networks that filtrate right through the log of the old tree. And these seedlings that are coming, you know, have germinated on what we would think of as a nurse log or coarse woody debris, are still connected to those old trees. And my graduate student, Gabriela Orrego, found that carbon actually did move from the crowns of these old trees right into the seedlings on the nurse log. So even in death and after death, these trees continue to function and are super important in regeneration. And many other ecosystem functions, including, you know, keeping the forest wet because they hold water, by keeping the diversity of the soil community diverse and intact, but by providing habitat for squirrels and all kinds of other organisms. And so these functions then, these keep our forests strong, right? These are why we have some of the most productive old growth ecosystems in the world, is because these natural systems are highly evolved. They've been around for thousands and thousands of years. They make forest societies strong and whole and connected and communicative. And that's why we can see the greatest productivity in these West Coast forests of the temperate forests. So what can we learn from this? You know, many things. And this has been celebrated and depicted and documented in the art of the nations over thousands of years. This is a painting by April White, who is a member of the Haida Nation. And she's showing here a picture of a woman who is in a canoe made of cedar, celebrated by the, you know, the whales that are painted on the side of that, and the salmon on the side of the boat. She's carrying with her some salmon bones that have been harvested in the estuaries, and she's returning those salmon bones to the waters, because not only as a giving of thanks for the great gifts of creation, but also to return the nutrients that are contained in those bones to keep the water strong and productive and healthy. So these are what scientists call complex adaptive systems, where all these different parts I just described to you, the bears, the wolves, the trees, the salmon, the fungi, the bacteria, the people, work together in a complex adaptive system. In a complex adaptive system, all these parts are important. They all have interactions with each other. And it is in these relationships that you find the strength. And it is so keeping these parts and the relationships strong are what keep our forests resilient. and what scientists call emergent properties. And so out of the relationships emerges these complex adaptive behaviors, which are, productivity, carbon storage, biodiversity, resistance to fire, resistance to pathogens, resilience, meaning the ability to reproduce and reforest. And so just keeping in mind that, when we throw out some of these parts or don't look after them, the emergence of these behaviors don't arise. They become reduced, and that leaves our forests very vulnerable. So I want to talk a little bit about that vulnerability now. So here we are back on the West Coast, so our West Coast ecosystems. You can see there's some islands here. There's an old growth forest here on this head. And then you can see there's a bunch of managed forests in the background. And you can see some of the roads that have built through here. These forests these back forests are not managed by the Aboriginal people. This is management that has been taken over by the state, I would say, by the Canadian government. It's managed at the provincial level or the state level. And it's public ownership of the land by and large, not private ownership. And the carrying of the land is parceled out or licensed out to major companies. We call them licensees. And these licensees follow, we're trying to follow ecosystem-based management based on what we know about forests, but really it hasn't translated very well over the last decades. And so these forests, you can see just in the crowns that they're more simple. The species composition is simpler. The forests are younger. When you walk into the forest, they don't look the same. They look like this instead of old growth forests. There's few species diversity. They've been weeded out of the understory plants. And so you don't have the same productive capacity because all the niches in the soil are no longer filled. So thinking back to that indigenous garden where they cultivated the plants, what we're finding when they cultivated plants and salmon and clam beds, that these have the richest carbon stores that I have ever found in the west coast of British Columbia. And it's because of all the parts are there in the ecosystem. This ecosystem doesn't have that. This is an ecosystem that needs restoration, where biodiversity is brought back into the forest. And also deer have become a big issue on the islands. And thinking back to those islands that have, remember I pointed out they have some of the most lush and diverse plant communities in British Columbia. They're considered endangered ecosystems now because deer have their populations have really exploded on these islands. Especially some of the larger islands. On Haida Gwa, you can't find plant communities are intact anymore. So you can see the difference, what's happened from here to here. The diversity has basically disappeared. And then we have invasive plants like gorse and Scotch broom moving in. And so these islands need to be restored as well. And shockingly, we're continuing to do practices that are quite devastating along the West Coast. There's a big shift in social consciousness about this now. Even though these practices are going on, people are going, maybe we should do things different, because these forests that we're managing here through clear-cut logging and planting are not the same as the old forests that we were once here. And when we look at what's left, these valley bottom forests, which were most heavily targeted by early logging, we only have about 3% of those left. And so there's an enormous pressure on the landscape, and there's an enormous need, I would say, to restore these landscapes from these simple plantations back to their old growth quality so they can go back to be sequestering carbon and housing the biodiversity that once were there. And also not just that, but to restore their resilience. What we find in these simplified plantations is that they're more vulnerable to bark beetles. This is the mountain pine beetle that has gone after a lodgepole pine forest that's been planted in the middle of an old growth mixed forest. So we have good evidence that these plantations are quite vulnerable to infestations. Also, the simple plantations are highly vulnerable to fire because the species that we've planted back, not only are they single species, but the conifers that we have coveted for the marketplace that we plant back are also the most vulnerable to wildfire. And so when you add up lots of plantations across a landscape, not only do fires propagate through them very well, but when other fires start, they feed into these these plantations, and they can rapidly move through our landscape. And that's what we have found in our years where we have 1 million hectares burning up to, or 1.5 million or 2 million hectares burning up every year, is that they're propagated through these plantations. So what we want to avoid is these cumulative effects on our landscape and creating these wicked stable states where we have big mortality due to insects and due to fire, and then adding on to that mortality, old forestry practices that are simplifying the landscape even further. And so we have learned a lot of lessons here in British Columbia and the West Coast about what we've done that doesn't work very well and what we can do. And what we can do is to start putting ourselves back in these ecosystems, because what we did is we actually took people out of the ecosystem that had managed them for thousands of years. We provided that resource to the government that then licensed out those big tenures to big companies that managed the landscape and didn't know their forests, right? It wasn't the family forest anymore. It was the corporate forest. And so people weren't looking on the landscape at what was going wrong. So we need to get back in there and start carrying out our responsibilities to look after these forests and work with all the creatures in the forest, the mycorrhizas, the trees, the deer, the wolves, the bears, work together with them and look after these forests in a better way. Instead of clear cutting the forest, select which ones that we can take out. It doesn't mean no logging. It means being very selective on how we look after the forest. It means making forests look like this after they've been harvested instead of a barren landscape where you have continuous cover or selective logging that maintains a high photosynthetic capacity. It means maintaining interconnected root systems that provide the foundation for the forest, that are full of mycorrhizas and full of that incredible soil network that provides the nutrients and resources for these trees to grow together and thrive. And so that we have these beautiful forests for the future that continue to sequester huge amounts of carbon and house the biodiversity and maintain a stable global climate. And I think with that, I'll say thank you so much, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Susan, for your astonishing presentation. Now we will open a Q&A session. We are ready for your questions. Do you have any questions here in the audience? So, okay. People are silent. Now, I have a lot of questions. How should we, you were talking about cutting out single trees. How do we select trees? It's simple the size, the bigger ones, take the smaller ones, or how do we, to avoid cutting a mother tree?
Yeah, you know what? I'm going to start out and say there's no single answer for that. Right? It depends on your ecosystem. And probably everybody here would agree on that. But, I think if you can leave the bigger trees and the older trees. So let me talk about bigger trees first. Like I said, they have larger crowns. They have greater photosynthetic capacity. That means there's more energy flowing through these trees to feed the soil networks. So they really are the energetic nuclei of the forest. So if you can maintain those old trees, they feed the forest ecosystem the most. But you don't have to, right? As long as you've got trees there that are photosynthesizing in good shape. Older trees are important because if you have older trees, if you don't have an even-aged forest, if it's uneven-aged, older trees are important because they accumulate biodiversity as they age. So remember I said that the mycorrhizal fungi, they have a succession over time. They start out very simple with a few fungi and then more and more accumulate until you've got a whole suite that are filling niches that are acquiring resources from the soil. And so if you have older trees with this diversity of mycorrhizas and other creatures of the food web, it will uptake resources from the soil, and you've got big crowns that are also, capturing light, and that will fuel the regeneration and the productivity of your forest more so than younger, smaller trees. And so thinning from below is a good idea, but of course, maintaining diversity in your forest is also important. And so one of the things that we're doing, and I have a project called the Mother Tree Project, is not just leaving seed trees or thinning from below, but using what we call variable retention, where we're leaving old trees as well as smaller trees to protect those older trees around them in patches and allowing them to seed into the gaps that we create through thinning. We've also done more heavy continuous cover thinnings from below, where we leave the older trees and then we're monitoring regeneration. So yeah, it really depends on your ecosystem, your values that you're trying to manage for, but generally bigger and older, we're finding is better for the ecosystem.
Okay, I'm thinking now we all have to read your books. But I have a question from a gentleman in the fourth row.
Hello, my name is Uwe Seyer. I'm working for FSC in Germany. I'm coming from a very much of a forestry culture that is about continuous forest cover. We in Middle Europe, I would say, and about selective logging, all of these kind of ideas. I find it a bit too short when you described the idea of forestry to protect our forests as carbon sinks, which is one of the main challenges. I'm very much with you, but at the same time, I think another challenge is to find the better balance between forests being a sink for carbon and at the same time a source for timber that is a renewable product. And particularly in North America, I have also some concerns as they do kind of either no forestry or clear-cut forestry. I think we do it a bit different in Middle Europe. So, but what would be your perspective on the most appropriate balance for these two products that we both need in forests?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the reason I talk about carbon quite a bit is because I feel like, we're in this climate crisis now, as you all know. We know that we've got to act quickly. We know that forests are a natural solution, and good forest management is a natural solution to climate change. That scientists have estimated that if we care for our forests well, that they can mitigate about 30 to 40% of climate impacts by sequestering more carbon, by drawing down CO2 in the atmosphere. And that's important. The other important thing about this is that we're developing carbon markets. And so, once the price of carbon gets high enough, then we're looking at a balance between the price of carbon sequestration versus the price we get from cutting down trees. And I think that once we get closer to that balance, or even when carbon prices exceed the price of wood on the market, that we're going to start making big management changes. And I think that's a positive thing. But really, what you're talking about is like we need to balance societal needs for wood with our needs for mitigating climate change. And how do we do that? And that's a really great question. I think that, they can go together. And I think that, I didn't show you so much of the application I've done of these ideas of connection in forest, but I have, and many of us have been working on trying to find that balance by harvesting trees using continuous cover forestry, which I think is what we're finding in our forests is protecting carbon stocks and biodiversity the most. Those are the most regenerative systems we're finding, and we're behind Europe in that way because we haven't done that. So we're learning as we go, but those systems are really good. And so going into, our second growth forests, which are managed forests, which is where I think that our focus needs to be. And I think that they probably, would, have similarities to European forests. Our old growth forests are different. I think that, we're going to start managing these second growth forests for timber more and more instead of mining our old growth forests. Really, that's what we've done. We need to protect those old growth forests because they're sources of biodiversity and carbon. But so then in these second growth forests, what do we do? How do we manage continuous cover forestry with those? And I think that what we need to do is really just, they're so dense and they're so uniform, is go in and open them up and foster the growth of the mother trees, right? To release them so that they get a little bit more energy into those individual trees, foster those nuclei. And then by opening up the forest to encourage the natural diversity that's basically being suffocated in the ground, right? The seed banks, the seed sources, they're there. They're just suffocated by this canopy of trees. Open it up so that they're sequestering more carbon, filling those niches. And to me, this is a really great model, and it's what's been practiced. Actually, it's more similar to the Aboriginal practices, and that have diversity and big carbon stocks. And also, of course, we need to restore our fisheries alongside it, because the salmon are the vectors between the ocean and land in our ecosystems, and are very much part of the productivity of the forest. So we also have to work on that problem as well. So I haven't answered your question too precisely, because I don't think there is a precise answer, but I think that there are ways, using continuous cover forestry to go into these second growth stands, take out trees, and at the same time, release the biodiversity that's there and restore the inherent resilience and productivity that was once there.
Thank you. So it's a way to combine. And we have another question from this lady behind in the back.
Yes, in Sweden we have lately found a loss of biodiversity in protected forests due to the lack of management. There's been a rewilding trend, and we see more damages of bark beetles, more monocultures, and this is. Do you see this in many areas, or is it a widespread problem? Because there are some important values and biodiversity that come from managing the forest.
I'm not sure I completely understood. I think what you said was that some of the rewilded forests are becoming vulnerable to disturbances. That's what you said, I think. So that could very well be. I mean, our old growth forests, we're not seeing that so much because they're primary forests. They still have incredible biodiversity in them, but they are vulnerable to drought for sure. And certainly, fires do start in them, and certainly beetles do have outbreaks in these old forests, but they're less vulnerable than our plantations. And I think it's just, all forests are vulnerable now because of climate change, even these old growth forests. And so how do we mitigate that? I think that, of course, looking after the global climate crisis is key. Sometimes it feels like it's out of our control, but really good, healthy forests, we are part of that solution. So I guess what I'm saying is that all forests are vulnerable. Our old growth forests aren't as vulnerable as our planted forests. We're seeing more damages in those than the old growth forests. But I think that, you can manage these second growth forests to increase biodiversity. So for example, how does that actually work? In our forests, think of the conifers, where we've packed them with conifers, right? Because that's our product. Those conifers are highly flammable because they have low water content in the needles and they're highly resinous. The deciduous trees, we've killed them because we sprayed herbicides to get rid of the aspens and the birches and the cottonwoods, the oaks and so on. And they have high water content in their leaves. And so we've actually increased the flammability of our forests. And so if what we need to do then is reintroduce the aspens and reintroduce the birches so that the forest is less flammable. And so that's one of the things that, as scientists, we're talking about. We haven't actuated it on the landscape yet, but in principle, it ought to work because, what we're doing right now, which is continuing this coniferous management strategy, this industrial strategy, isn't working. It's actually making things worse. So, overall, I empathize that rewilding some of your forests they're still vulnerable. I think all forests around the world are vulnerable right now, but keeping the basic principles of biodiversity and what keeps your forest less flammable and less vulnerable are the keys that you need to hang on to, and just try different things because that's what your toolkit is.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from the first row here from Ronald. Yeah, Sten.
Does it work? Or? Yeah, okay. Susan, this is Ronald from Quidster. So my question is, like you were talking about the mycorrhizas as being a very important piece of, the keeping forest healthy. Yeah. So my question is, since you have also identified these this mycorrhiza. Yeah, is there some sort of, I don't want to call it shortcut, but a possibility to help, for example, plantages, like to kind of extract this mycorrhiza, produce it somewhere in a different environment, and then inject it into monoculture type of forest to kind of like help it and boost the mycorrhiza system in there? Or is biodiversity and mycorrhiza so connected that it's not possible also like to help and support the forests?
There's definitely a role for people to play here. So, especially in ecosystems that have been really reduced in their diversity already, and afforestation. I know there was talk of afforestation early on. So, repopulating areas that were turned to urban areas or parks or agricultural fields, and you want to afforest those, they would be missing the matching mycorrhizas that the trees will need, or they'll be very low in the ecosystem. And so to do this reforestation and afforestation of areas that have been degraded from the natural condition, they all need some help. And you can add mycorrhizal slurries to those when you plant seedlings. We do that here in North America sometimes. And there are products out there. And so that will help the seedlings get going. I've done research on this myself. I didn't use commercial inoculum. I used inoculum that I took from an old growth forest, but it really makes a huge difference. And so once those seedlings get going, because they've got the mycorrhizas and they get established, then what happens is that often that the spore load from the neighboring forest or the existing hyphae that are in the soil will kind of take over and start colonizing those live seedlings. But the reason they're able to do that is because the seedling now has got enough crown area that it can provide the energy needed to support those mycorrhizas. So I think it's really important, yes, to develop products that have matching mycorrhizas for those ecosystems to help those seedlings get started, and then the ecosystem will take over and it will develop naturally from there.
Susan, a question from my side. This event is a lot about reforestation. What's the best way to do it, from your opinion? Reforestation?
Yeah, so I've done a lot of reforestation myself, and there's so many ways, right? Historically, I would say, natural regeneration has been how forests have developed without human intervention, at least where I'm from. And of course, naturally sourced seed in local ecosystems are best co-adapted to their mycorrhizas and the soil organisms, and they're locally adapted to their environment. But of course, climate is changing very quickly. And so these trees and genotypes are actually becoming outpaced by climate. The velocity of climate change is way faster than these trees can, and their mycorrhizal symbionts can actually move. And so it's important. And what we're doing is we're actually migrating seedlings, now assisted migration into new climates. And so this is, reforesting with planted seedlings. And we're trying to match the genotypes, or at least test different genotypes in shifting climates. And one of the things that we have found, which I think you'll find interesting, is that when we plant these migrants, because they're quite vulnerable to variations in climate, as we know that there's going to be climatic extremes that these young seedlings are going to have to face. How do we protect them against that? Because that can, one hard frost and you can lose your whole plantation. But what we're finding is that when you leave the old trees behind, the mother trees, or any kind of tree canopy, and plant underneath them, or maybe and you'd have to work with how open that canopy should be in order for those seedlings to survive. But we're finding that new migrants, that their survival is going up by 10 or 20 or 30%, depending on where you are. So the old trees are facilitating the new migrants that we're planting into these new forests. The other thing I would say, and I've done a ton of planting throughout my 40-year career and worked with regeneration, is that planting diverse forests, again, is really important. We focus so much early on planting one species, then maybe two, but actually planting a mix of species if you can, and then encouraging the native plant community, instead of getting rid of it, encourage it so that it can network in with these planted seedlings. And then you've got to manage those seedlings, right? Some of those native plants will outgrow or overtop or suppress. And so you've got to keep an eye on, cultivating and making sure that your planted seedlings have the resources, that they're not overcrowded and overshaded. So it really becomes a craft and a cultivation and very fine scale management to protect those seedlings.
Okay, thank you very much. We have one last question from Mr. Sayer.
Thank you. Me again. Another challenging question. There is different concepts that are discussed in regards to upcoming climate changes and forest adaptations. I mean, I'm personally very much in favor of your kind of concept of increasing resilience and taking care about the natural dynamics of forests and these kind of things. But in some cases, particularly in Middle Europe, we're discussing very much, okay, we may run out of some trees that may not be adapted to some site conditions in future site situations. And then there is discussions around introducing not native species, Douglas fir in Middle Europe, for example, or other species coming from other regions. What would be, I mean, I heard loud and clear your perspective on resilience and these kind of things, but what would be your perspective on introducing not native species, particularly in regards to mycorrhiza and all these kind of aspects that are beyond a simple debate of one or two species that seem to be a chance for forestry in the future?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I don't know what there's no single answer to this, but we're, as people, we have to be involved in our ecosystems to help them, adjust, adapt, and evolve with climate change. We're beyond the choice. We've got to be involved. And that includes migrating species. It includes migrating genotypes. It includes working with the symbionts to make sure they have what they need, because we need the forest cover. We need these forests to be healthy and sequestering carbon. They're the only natural, they're our biggest solution to climate change, other than, of course, reducing the sources of our CO2 gases. So it might mean, migrating species that were not there in the past. It might mean bringing in their mycorrhizal inoculums that were not there in the past. And we know, though, from our history, our long human history of moving species around the world, that they can have positive and negative effects, right? We've been moving stuff around for a long, long time. And they can become, invasive. They can become pathogenic. They can take out whole forests. And so I think it's got to be done really cautiously. And that means, as foresters, we've got to be on the ground watching this, or forest people. We can't just do it whole scale and then let it go and say, oh, what's going to happen? It's got to be done meticulously and carefully. And so I always, in coming from North America, where people are constantly being removed from the landscape, where we're not living in our forests anymore, and we're just sort of handing it over to the state to look after them, that is not a solution, right? We need to be, as people, working carefully, moving things around so that we maintain cover, but monitoring it very, very carefully. We need people that know what they're doing.
Okay, I have to wind up this Q&A session. Thank you very much. A big applause for Susan. Thank you very much.
Thank you
for
so
your
much.
insights, and greetings from Tyrol to British Columbia next time. Hopefully you move over. Have a good time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hey, have a great conference.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.